So our last talk of the morning will be, the title is MUI, Mindfulness and Our Interconnected Reality. And so we're really excited to have Dan Siegel back at Wisdom 2.0, Mindfulness America. And so I think one of the kind of big issues in our life that Dan and I were just talking about, which is how do we actually connect? How do we connect to ourselves? How do we connect to another person? How do we connect to nature? And I think we're living in a time where, at least for me, I notice I look at the news in the morning and I instantly get grumpy. And I instantly get frustrated, and that frustration sometimes just starts to play out in other parts of my life. And so it's a real challenging time, and I think it's a time where for most of us, we largely live disconnected. And if we watch cable news, we hear all sorts of negative stuff about who we view as the other and who we view as opposing us. And so I feel like it's a time where we as people have to understand who we really are, but we also have to understand our interconnectedness with everybody else and everything else. So Dan is going to speak to that. A little bit about Dan. Dr. Dan Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's also the executive director of the MindSight Institute, focusing on the development of MindSight, which teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dan is also the author of tons and tons of books. So if you Google Dan Siegel, Amazon, or any other book, you can see his plethora of writing on the brain, on mindfulness, on MindSight. So please welcome Dan Siegel to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Soren. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, let's first of all take a big breath. Wasn't that an amazing panel we just had? Oh, wow. What we have is the opportunity to talk right now about mindfulness, the topic of the day, and we're going to be looking at it through a lens where in the work we do at the MindSight Institute, we try to bring all the fields of science together into one framework. We call it interpersonal neurobiology, but it's really about seeing the big picture, using science as a beginning place, but not an ending place. And so with the word mindfulness, you've heard a lot about it so far this morning. And what we just want to say about it is there's a tension among researchers in the mindfulness world about what exactly it means as a word. So we'll just outline some basic things in the first word of the title of this talk, mindfulness, just to say that some people, and many people would agree, it includes training your mind to have focused attention. So it's the first pillar of training. The second is to open awareness in a way that we'll talk about in a lot of detail today. And for some, that's what mindfulness training is, focused attention and open awareness training. Others, and I've been in rooms with some of the researchers who debate this, others would say, well, let's also include what you have heard today as well, loving kindness, that the word mindfulness includes loving kindness. Another group says absolutely does not include loving kindness. So you should say mindfulness and loving kindness training, and the other mindfulness people mindfully say, no, that's included. So when I was with all these folks, when I was finishing my book, Aware, and I had this thing that our daughter, Maddie Siegel, had made on mindfulness, the pillars of mindfulness training, I had to change it to the pillars of mind training, and all the researchers in the room agreed that was fine. So we call it three-pillar training, so you don't have to keep on saying all the different, this group thinks that, and whatever. So what does it mean to train your attention, to open awareness, and to build a state of kindness? You've heard a number of things this morning when David and Richie were on the stage, about this fascinating finding about gamma synchrony, these gamma oscillations. What does that mean? Well, it means that the different areas of the brain are being linked together. And from a neurological point of view, it's fair to call that neural integration. And in our field, interpersonal neurobiology, we're fascinated with that because integration, which is defined as different things being supported in their differences, honored for their differences, thriving with those differences, and, not or, but and linking, and in the linkage, not losing the differentiation. So using the term integration this way implies basically a fruit salad, not a smoothie. Okay, so that you're establishing that you can have your differentiated nature and also be a part of a larger whole. Now, it turns out in the field that I'm trained in, attachment research, we study parent-child relationships, and it's fair to summarize all of the research on attachment and its correlation with brain research in the following ridiculously simple statement. And I had 18 interns work with me to try to disprove this, and I gave them the assignment, prove that this is wrong because it's just too simple. And so we spent a year with them trying to do it. And the third edition of this textbook, The Developing Mind, I'm not suggesting you read it unless you want to go to sleep. It's, it's one of these dense, thousands of references books. But in that book, what you'll see is this very simple statement backed up by lots and lots and lots of research. Here it goes. When relationships are integrated, that is, when we see another individual in front of us and honor their differentiated nature and say, you have a body, and whatever the history of that body is, whatever your ancestors have been, we honor that. We bring them to mind, that sati term you heard about what mindfulness in some ways means, bringing back to mind, reminding. And we honor that difference, while at the same time, in a relationship, whether it's a parent-child relationship or a romance or whatever, we're also linking with compassionate concern. We want to know what's going on in that person and have a kind, loving connection with them. And in the linkage that happens, we don't lose that. So basically, in parent-child relationships, we study what's called secure attachment, which is essentially an integrated relationship between a parent and a child. Okay, fine. Amazingly, if a child has, in a reliable way, and when ruptures are there, it's repaired, an integrated relationship, if you go inside their brain, they have an integrated brain. And why is that important? Because, as my interns can tell you, every form of regulation that we study from a scientific point of view depends on integration in the brain. What are they? The regulation of attention, of emotion and mood, of thought, of reflecting on thought, called metacognition, of autobiographical memory and awareness, which we call insight, of relationality, and even of morality. The interns could find nothing to go against the statement, and tons to support it, that integration is the basis for every form of regulation. You always want to be nervous when you say every. We couldn't find an exception, let's just say it that way. So let's say it very simply. Integrated relationships lead to integrated brains, which lead to optimal regulation, which is the basis for resilience and well-being. Any questions? That's it. So let's look at what's going on when you're not integrated. When you're integrated versus when you're not integrated, what we know is that when you're integrated, you have 5 qualities. And those of you who know me well know I have an addiction. This is the first symptom. What am I addicted to? Acronyms, thank you. We have an Acronyms Anonymous group. It's actually a subset of the people in this room. And so the first acronym is FACES. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. Let's go through them one by one. When you're integrated, you're flexible, meaning you can adapt and move around and change in a fluid way. Adaptive, which now means what the situation is you appreciate. So in mindfulness, it means you acknowledge what is and you open to it. And this kind of acceptance is not a passive state. When you accept something, it doesn't mean there's injustices, I accept them, big deal, who cares? No, it's just the opposite. Is I accept them, meaning I see that they're there, I'm not trying to contort my perception, and now I'm going to do something about it. And the doing something about it comes from the see. The coherence is where you feel this kind of resilience inside of you and a resolve to take action. So when Michelle beautifully brought us all together at the 1440 Retreat Center, and we realized the federal government was on furlough, you were amazing, you were a Red Bull, and Michelle goes, okay, we're all gathered here, no one's shown up because they're not allowed to show up. Let's just stream this to the whole federal government. And we did. And it was amazing. And I'm glad Mindful has that, thanks to Jim and Barry. So now what you see is with coherence, you have resilience from integration. Integration is what creates this faces flow. You're energized, that's the E, a sense of vitality. And you're stable, not meaning you're stuck, it means you can rely on yourself. So when Michelle talks about, or everyone talks about, what they bring to it, or if you think about what the last panel we were talking about, when you're traumatized, you're not integrated. Trauma is an impairment to integration. Even if you look at Marty Teicher's work from Harvard on abuse and neglect, early developmental trauma, it impairs integration in the brain. Okay, so the bottom line is, I'm a newbie to mindfulness. Caroline Welch, who's our CEO at the Mindsight Institute and my life partner also, she's been meditating for decades, and I would, as kind of a person, steeped in science, and there was no science behind meditation those days, I would say, well, that's just what your spouse does. Oh, well, you kind of just say that's kind of some quirky thing. So I'm a latecomer to it. She's an old-timer to it. But when I was introduced to it through an interaction with John, where's John Kabat-Zinn, somewhere here, it was like, I don't know anything about it. He goes, you better go meditate, go do a retreat. So I did this retreat, a silent retreat, the first time I meditated. I don't recommend it. For a week. I mean, I recommend a retreat, but not the first time you're going to meditate. And there were all these people there I wanted to talk to, including John, but you couldn't because it was a silent retreat. So anyway, so for me, as like an attachment person, what was amazing was that our research outcome data on what happens when you have a loving, attuned, secure relationship with your parent over time is you develop this faces capacity, you become integrated. And then I do the mindfulness stuff and I read all of John and Richie's research, which back in those days, was in the early 2000s, there wasn't that much out. It was identical to the secure attachment research. Amazing. Why, as David asked, and Rhonda came back and said, well, it's not really private, but in general, you start with this inner work. Why would inner work lead to the same outcomes as a loving relationship? Because I think they're both integrative. The parent-child integration is an interpersonal attunement that leads to integration, and the mindfulness begins but doesn't end with an internal attunement that produces, as John Kabat-Zinn beautifully talks about, the relationality that is mindfulness. So mindfulness is, I think, a deep way you develop faces in your life. That literally, if you look at every study, at least my interpretation of the brain studies of mindfulness interventions across all the different types that Richie talked about, they're ultimately creating more integration in the brain. That's basically how to summarize them. So then you go, okay, that's cool. The next word of the title of this talk is MUI. So here at the Garrison Institute, meaning this is co-sponsored, not just by Wisdom 2.0, but by the Garrison Institute. I'm on the board, I'm the co-chair of the program committee there. We try to link together three things: contemplative practice, inner wisdom; science, clear empirical research; and positive action in the world to reduce social injustice, to enhance environmental health, and other things that we do in education, all sorts of fields. So from a Garrison point of view, what this notion of how we bring this inner wisdom to play in one of our initiatives is about planetary health. And the first time I was faced with this was when I was asked to give a talk at a climate change policymakers meeting at our institute. And I said I had no idea why they asked me to be there, because I didn't know anything about climate issues. Our daughter is now in school studying that in graduate school, but I didn't know anything about it at the time. And they said, well, we've tried to inform people, it didn't help. We've tried to scare people, an inconvenient truth, and less people got interested because they kind of withdraw when they're frightened. As Richie was pointed out, you contract with fear. So I said, and they said, so we've invited you. So I said, so what are you going to do? They go, we have no idea. I said, okay, well, how about if you can't, scare people into doing something or inform them, maybe you can, I don't know, transform them. They go, that's great. What does that mean? I said, well, I don't know what that means, but let's see what it means. And you can watch that tape where, like, I then get up on the stage to try to address their concerns. But the issue is, and here's what the we thing is, and it came from that meeting. And it goes like this. And now this is stepping way, way, way back, both evolutionarily, but also stepping way back in terms of our way of considering things. So I'm going to say a few things that are going to sound a little strange. And so what I want you to do is try to soak them in. And it goes like this. All of us in this room now are essentially manifestations of energy. When energy is condensed, as Einstein taught us with energy equals mass times speed of light squared, you are basically condensed energy, really smushed in mass, which is a large collection of small units of energy, so we call it a macrostate. Okay? Let's do the macrostate world over here. Okay? In the macrostate world, you're born from sperm and egg. I don't want to surprise anyone, but that's how it starts. You're born, and then you get into this body, and then, you come out here amazingly, and here you are, okay? In this human body. You could have been a frog or a salamander or a tree, right? But no, you happen to be a human being. Here you are. Okay, now, you get bombarded with energy, and the way we understand the mind, and this is the first time we're using that word, is that the mind has got to figure out what in the world is going on, right? So what it does is this. The first thing it does is it categorizes stuff. What's the left and what's the right? What's up and down, right? What's male or what's female? What's black, what's white? All this stuff. And the categories that we create are beneath the surface of awareness. What emerges from those categories are concepts, like there's something called gender, female, male. There's something called race, or there's even something called self or other. And these categories and concepts are so buried, they're like an iceberg, that when you finally get to the tip of the iceberg above the water, which are the words we use, the symbols, those symbols are reflections of the concepts and categories we're usually not even aware of. Okay, that's the background story. Here's a proposal. It could be completely wrong, and it might be correct, and if it is correct, it has a call to action in it. And here's the proposal, but just keep in mind, it's just a proposal. In contemporary culture, not usually indigenous peoples that still exist today in various places on the planet, but in contemporary times, and I was once teaching at a place, and I had an opportunity to ask His Holiness the Dalai Lama a question. I said, well, in the West, we think this way. And he said, no, don't talk like that. It's not the West, it's the whole world. It's the contemporary world. And my son, who was 15 at the time, sticks his elbow into me and he goes, the Dalai Lama gotcha. So don't ever do the West-East thing, or else the Dalai Lama will get you, or my son. Okay, so contemporary culture basically has done the following things. And there's a lot of science behind what I'm going to say, but this is the proposal. It's made the category of self versus other turn into a concept that there is actually something called the self that is a solo thing that lives in your body and has a term called self or I or me. And the solo self that emerges in contemporary times, if it's believed to be the totality of your identity, is an error. Let's just put it diplomatically like that. It's an error. Now, E.O. Wilson, on page 52 of his book, The Meaning of Human Existence, writes that because human beings as a species have relied on the sensory flow of auditory and visual input, we get the false perception that we're separate from each other and separate from other species and separate from the environment. Now, he says, when we were few in number, that wasn't such a big deal. It was just a peculiarity, a false perception is called an illusion. And who cares? Well, when we're 7 billion strong, the who cares of that is we're about to destroy life on Earth. That's a serious illusion. Einstein has a quote that many mindfulness teachers use, and it's a beautiful quote. I think the first person to use it was John. And the quote is from a letter Einstein wrote. It's a long story about a friend and someone died, but this is where the letter came from. But it basically said that there's an optical delusion of consciousness that human beings basically are separated from the rest of the universe. So Einstein took it further than Wilson and said it's not just a false perception called an illusion. It's a psychotic belief. Now, let's honor these two scientists, and let's assume for a moment they're absolutely right on the money. That the separate self is an illusion or a delusion, and that we are now, in the next dozen years, facing a huge, huge question. Can we wake up and become aware of the concepts and categories beneath the surface of things that seem benign, like I, me, mine, or self, that are actually about to destroy life on Earth? So let me give you a potential way we can get out of this. And the simplest thing to say is that, okay, you're not just a me, right? That's in your body, that's fine. But you're also a we. And to get a really integrated identity, we need to raise children, adolescents, and raise ourselves as adults to stop thinking that who we are is just me. That we don't want to go from me to we and give up the me. That's an error. That's going to also be a problem because you do have a body, and the body has a history. And you want to sleep the body well, you want to take care of the body by feeding it, exercising it, enjoying it. That's all an individuality, it's an interiority, it's all a me, just use that term. But who we are is also a we, so that's where the we comes from. Now, let's look at why we got so confused and to think that who you are is a me. And me can be plural, by the way. Me can be all people with my same last name, or all people in my religion, or all people with my skin color, or all that kind of stuff where it's a plural me. It's still a me. It's not the intra-nature sense of identity that we're really needing to cultivate. So let's look at this. When you look at the physics of the universe, or you look at the biology that Wilson was referring to, we're going to see a clue as to, number one, why we as humans got confused, and number two, a pathway to resolving the problem. Because the solo self as the solo source of identity is not only an illusion and a delusion, you could call it a lethal lie. And if we don't correct that lethal lie, we're going to die. It's that important, and I'm not trying to be hysterical about it, but you know we are on a pathway towards massive destruction, and you could say that all of that destruction comes from the mind's delusion of a separate self. So how did it come about? Let's put the macro state world over here, and let's compare it to a different world over here. Now let me just ask you a question. How many of you know, and I did this at Wisdom 2.0 last, whenever it was, in March, how many of you know that physics has established that in the one reality we live in, there are two profoundly distinct realms? Raise your hand if you know that. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 4. And there's what, about 400 people here? So that's the same percentage before. It was 3,000 people in the other room, and only 30 raised their hand. So that's 1% of very motivated people who came to a meeting like this, or Wisdom, or other, I've done this like with educators and therapists, it's always around 1%. That means that 99% of us don't know something that science has established. It was on the cover of Scientific American in July of 2018. So what are these two realms? I'm going to give you the overview of the realms, and I'd like you just to sit with this in your bodies and see how it feels, and then we'll come up with what that means. In the macrostate world, Isaac Newton studied this 350 years ago, came up with a bunch of mathematical principles and properties and equations that could say, you know, when planets move around, why do they move the way they do? Those are macrostates, accumulations of matter. Here are the properties of macrostates. They act as if they were noun-like entities that interact with each other but that are fundamentally separate. The moon is separate from the earth, for example. You are separate from me. We are separate from nature. That kind of thing. That's the macrostate world. In the macrostate world, you have what's called an arrow of time. It's a directionality of change. You and I crack open an egg, we can't uncrack it. Now, when you leave those accumulations of matter that are condensed energy and you move into this other realm, same reality, different realm, like when you swim, sometimes when you're swimming, you put your head above the water and the air, take a breath, and then you go underwater. There's an air realm and a water realm. Nobody freaks out about swimming and doing the breaststroke. Oh my God, there's a water realm and an air realm. How can this be? Well, you can learn to swim in these two realms of the one reality with mindfulness. In the microstate realm, which was started to be studied about 100 years ago in scientific terms, poets have probably known about this and spiritual visionaries forever. But anyway, the scientists studied about 100 years ago. These are small things like electrons and photons. In this realm, things are not noun-like entities that are separate. They're verb-like events that are massively interconnected. The reality of the world that's beneath all these realms is massive interconnection. That's just the reality of interconnection, right? And there is no arrow of time here. Now, this is a realm full of probabilities. This is a realm full of certainties. So when you take an airplane, you don't want to ride on Quantum Airlines that says we'll probably get from New York to Sydney. You want to ride on Qantas Airlines because there's certainty there. Okay, so here's the path forward. Here's the path forward. We have a practice at the Institute called the Wheel of Awareness. It's a very simple practice. It says if consciousness is needed for change and integration is needed for health, those are two consilient findings, and you put them together, what would happen if you integrated consciousness? So we've had lots and lots and lots of people do them from our website. We do it for free, we give it away. But also, we've had lots of people do it in person. And we get their reports on what the experience was. In the hub of the wheel, how many of you have done the wheel so I can just see? Okay, so quite a few. So you know in the hub, it's represented awareness, the knowing. On the rim, it's what you are the knowns. When you distinguish the knowing from the knowns in this practice, when people get into the hub, and this is how I'll finish up the talk, whether they're computer scientists who've never meditated before in their lives, or I'll give you one example of a parliamentarian where we did the wheel. He does the practice. We bend the spoke of attention around into pure awareness in the hub. He comes to me at the break. He says, I didn't want to share. I said, okay, why not? And he goes, he becomes very teary. He goes, never before in my life, when I bent that spoke around into the hub, that hub of pure awareness, never before in my life, he said, now with tears in his eyes, did I ever feel so much love before in my life. I've never felt so connected to everyone or to everything. And now he's full on cry. And there's this silence between the two of us. And I said, so you didn't want to share? He goes, oh, no. He points over to his parliamentarian colleagues. He says, they would think I was weak. So there's this silence between the two of us. I said, I can understand you didn't want to appear weak. He goes, oh, no. And I said, but let me ask you a question. And he said, what? I said, so I understand you didn't want to share it, but when you're establishing federal law, when you're making national policy, do you leave love out of your reasoning? And his eyes get really, really big. His fingers come up and they start wagging at me. And he runs over to his colleagues, and I have no idea what they talked about. But you would only hope that the reality of interconnection that dropping into pure awareness accesses for you. This is why mindfulness is so important. Because ultimately, I think mindfulness integrates consciousness by distinguishing the knowing of being aware from the knowns in all sorts of different ways you can do that. The wheel is just one way to do it. There's many, 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 many ways to do it. But when you do that, and here's, after doing this with 45,000 people and doing very careful analysis of the first 10,000 reports, of the reports of the first 10,000 people to do it, here's the amazing thing I'll close with. In pure awareness, why this is the case, I don't know, but in pure awareness, three things are there. Presence, this feeling of I am here, which extends this sense of what the self actually is, from not just a me and a body, but also a we. That's where the we comes from. Second is huge interconnection. The word interconnection is used over and over and over again. In terms of nature, it's like you come to realize, like the Pandal forest, you're not just these 57,000 seemingly separate trunks of an aspen tree. This is in Utah. But you go 6 inches beneath the surface, and you find it's one common root ball. The Pandal forest is this example of our deep interconnectivity, even though in the macrostate surface world we don't see it, because we're born into bodies and we have the illusion and delusion. Interconnectivity is the second thing. The third thing, and as a scientist, I'm nervous to say this, and in our we community, we have a we community which you're all welcome to join. I said to them, I said, I don't know what to do because scientists are not supposed to talk about love. But in the scientific survey of the wheel, the third thing besides presence, interconnectivity, the third thing to come up is love. That when you drop into this hub of open awareness, love is what people describe. And it's a universal love. It's this love, not just I'm romantically in love or sexually in love or have a love for a particular person. It's this huge caring, concern, this positive life force that seems to emerge as if love, interconnection, and presence, this open awareness, are three threads of a singular fabric of the universe. And when we live only in the macrostate world, we aren't aware of the reality of interconnection. We live only in this contemporary culture with the systems teachings that we're separate, and we're gonna all die that way. We have this incredible opportunity to see the climate crisis, to see social injustice, to see all these incredibly important and powerful challenges to all of us as not just a burden, but actually an opportunity to transform the way we in contemporary humanity are living in a more integrated way. And when we live as a we together can make this a kinder, more connected, more compassionate world. Thank you so much for your attention.